Testing, testing, 1, 2. Let's see if people can hear me. Yeah, can you guys hear me okay? If you want to ask any questions, you can just leave make a comment in the live chat. Okay, cool. So we'll just wait for everybody to get here. Guys, when you get into this, once you've got in, can you put a comment saying your name as I know you, and so I know that you're here, seeing as your YouTube names are all different from your actual names. I expect this is probably going to take around about an hour or so. And you'll have to forgive me if I'm looking jittery. I drank way too much coffee today. We had like 5 cups. No worries, take your time, man. Oh wait, but I'm talking to Omar using the WhatsApp. Okay, so we got Atika and Maruf so far. Who else? Apparently 10 people watching already. 11 now. I feel famous. Hi Ace Show, who are you? Yeah, no worries, Omar. Hi Ariane. Hi JP. Hi Rochelle. Hi Iman. Hi Saiful. Hi Nawaz. We'll just give it a couple more minutes. We're still waiting for Azri and Faiz, of course. Does anybody know if Amy is joining? Hi Manu, how are you? Oh, there you are. Hey, Amy. Below. Hang on, guys. I'm just going to go up and get my charger. I'm back in 2.5 seconds. Have we got Fizzle McFreakin' Dizzle yet? Guys, have we got Faiz and Azri yet? Oh, there you go. Azri. Okay. Azri, just click on the link. Oh, wait, no, he's not in the stream. Sorry, I keep getting confused. All right, cool. What about Faiz? We got Faiz or not? No Faiz then. Okay. All right, guys. Alrighty then. How's it going, guys? And welcome to the first live stream for Delirium Cafe KLCC. Okay, guys, so today we're going to be covering some basic stuff to do with fermentation and your beer basics. We're also going to be going into a little bit more advanced detail that I've gone in before. But keep in mind that after the stream, we're going to have a bit of a Q&A session. So if you guys want to ask any questions, you'll be more than welcome to ask them later on. And as usual, if it's something I don't know, thank you very much, because that always provides me with the opportunity to learn about things as well. So if you're ready, we'll get started. All right, so the first thing we're going to do a recap of fermentation. Now, I do hope that you all remember what fermentation is, but just as a basic recap, fermentation is the process of yeast consuming sugar and creating alcohol and carbon dioxide as a byproduct. So fermentation is the base process behind all alcoholic beverages, whether it is beer, wine, or spirits. It all starts with fermentation, and then what comes after that is usually what will define whether it is beer or a wine or a spirit. Okay, so let's get on to, so what are the basic ingredients that you need for fermentation? So you're going to need three things. You're going to need water, you're going to need sugar, and you're going to need yeast. Okay, so starting off with yeast. Now, I hope you guys can remember what yeast is, but if you can't, what yeast is a single-celled fungus. It's a living organism, and it is literally everywhere. There are thousands of different strains of yeast, but the two types of yeast that we use when we're talking about brewing are Saccharomyces cerevisiae and Saccharomyces pastorianus. So let's see how many of you remember that. But Saccharomyces cerevisiae is more commonly known as brewer's yeast, and it's the older of the two types of yeast. Saccharomyces cerevisiae is used to brew ales. Okay, Saccharomyces pastorianus, on the other hand, is the yeast which is used to brew lagers. Now, there are other yeasts that you can use to brew beer, but the two, cerevisiae and pastorianus, are the most common. So the second ingredient that you need to brew beer is grain. Now, more specifically, malted grain. So now, as I have mentioned before in training sessions at Delirium, grain is typically 5 things. So you've got barley, wheat, corn, rye, and rice. Okay, and also oats. Oats is another one that can be used in beer brewing, but barley and wheat are the most common that are used. Barley being first, and then wheat being second. So now you cannot just ferment barley. Okay, there is a certain process that it needs to undergo in order to make it so that the yeast is actually able to consume the sugars in it and create alcohol from that. And that process is what is referred to as malting. Okay, and which I'm going to explain in a couple of minutes. I just want to cover the last ingredient first, which is the water. Now, it cannot be understated how important the water is in the brewing of beer. In fact, many brewers will tell you that the water is one of the most important ingredients in beer. So I know it doesn't really sound like it makes any sense. I mean, water is water. Oh, that's great, Altair.
I give mommy a crystal. I gave you.
Sorry.
Greenies.
It looks like a stack of pancakes. And is
No,
that?
I have a spring and another sword.
That's awesome. Thank you, Altair. Okay, sorry guys. Anyway, where was I? That's right, water. Most important ingredient. Now, on the surface, it doesn't seem to make any sense because water is water, right? But this is not particularly true. On a chemical level, when you get down into the, like the actual molecule components of water, it does make a big difference to the final product. which is why you'll often find brewers often boasting about why the water source that they use is so important. A good example of this is Guinness. Okay, so it's not uncommon to hear that Guinness from Dublin in Ireland is far better than Guinness here in Malaysia. And why is that? Is because Guinness in Dublin is made using a very specific water source, which is very good for making Guinness. Whereas the Guinness that they produce here in Malaysia is made using local Malaysian water, which, let's be honest, is pretty crap. So yeah, it is a very important ingredient, and purity is most definitely a thing. Okay, so moving on, right? So now that we've talked about the individual ingredients needed to make beer, let's talk about malting to start off with. Okay, so malting is not just the process of roasting the grain. It's a lot more detailed and a lot more important than that, because as I mentioned just before, you can't simply just take some barley and then toast it and chuck it in some water and then create fermentation. The process of malting is actually what prepares the grain, the barley or the wheat, or whatever you're using, in a way that allows the yeast to convert those sugars into alcohol. So basically the process starts with they get the grain, be it, let's go with barley, seeing as that's the most common, and they'll soak it. Okay, so they soak it for around about 8 hours, and then they will take it out of the water, allow it to dry a bit, or like say overnight, and then they'll soak it again. And what this does is it actually it triggers the seed to start growing. This is called germination. So basically this is when the seed kind of splits open a bit and a little like white thing start, a bit of the root, what will eventually be the root, starts to poke out of it. So that's germination, and that in particular is the process that it starts triggering inside the grain. It starts triggering the development of these enzymes called amylase. So there's two types of enzymes which are developed: alpha amylase and beta amylase. Now, sorry if this is getting a bit confusing for you guys, but not to worry. I'm not going to rip your head off if you can't remember this. But like I said, I wanted to get into a bit more detail about the fermentation process and all that sort of stuff. So alpha amylase and beta amylase. So these two enzymes are actually what convert the starches and the proteins inside the seed into sugars. And the specific sugars that we're talking about here are maltose and dextrose. Okay. Once the enzymes have started to convert those what do you call it? Starches into sugars, the grain is now ready to be roasted. Now the roasting process is how they stop the germination, because you don't want the seed to fully germinate. If that happens, then the root that I explained before is going to consume all of the starch in the seed, and then it will no longer be able to be fermented because it won't have any sugars inside it. Okay, so just to recap: soak the grain, dry the grain, soak it again. Once it starts to sprout a little seed, a little shoot, right? Then they roast it, and the roasting process is what stops the germination, and also that is where a lot of the flavor of the beer comes from. Okay. So depending on how dark you roast it, that's going to usually define what sort of beer you want to go with at the end of the brewing process. All right. So for example, if it was a really dark roast, then that's what you're going to use to create stouts and porters and doubles and that sort of thing. Whereas if it's a lighter roast, that's what you might use to make a blonde ale, for example. Okay. So there is another method which can be used to prepare grain for fermentation without germinating it, and that is through chemistry. So basically, by using raw grain and adding in the enzymes, you know, from, like, let's say a lab grown enzyme, which is very easy and very common to do these days, you're able to thus ferment unroasted grains, which would give you a completely different flavor profile. So this sort of thing is most commonly used with white ales. So I think many of you, especially those of you that have worked in Delirium, have tasted the Floris Wheat, for example, which, as you know, is a very light, floral, fruity beer. And that is because the wheat is not roasted, okay? And it also is what gives it that really white, cloudy color, because it's also not filtered, right? So that covers the malting, right? And next ingredient and how it's prepared is the hops. Okay, so what are hops? Now, hops are little flowers of a plant. It's a vine, and it looks, well, from what a lot of people say, it looks a bit like cannabis. To me, it doesn't look like cannabis. I find that it looks it, it looks like a hop. I can't really think of anything else that describes it. But hops are what create the bitter and aromatic flavors in beer. Okay, so there are usually hops will fall into two or technically three categories. Okay, so you've got um, you have aromatic hops and bittering hops. Okay, and then there are certain types of hops that can be used for both aromatic and bittering purposes. Okay, but at its core, right, there are hundreds of different varieties of hops that are grown in different regions all over the world, and each of them has their own characteristics which they will impart to beer. So what creates the bitter flavor from hops is they contain these things called alpha acids. Now, I'm not going to get into too much detail about that because I think I've given you guys enough chemistry already, but very simply, bittering hops are typically added first in the boiling stage of the beer, and they are used to create the bitter taste, right? So some examples of bittering hops would be Apollo, Centennial, and Chinook, okay? Then the other type are aromatic hops. So these are the sorts of hops that you would add to give a more aromatic and fruity note to a beer. A really good example of this would be, if you guys can think of IPAs that have like that really strong fruity note on it, they have had aromatic and bittering hops added. So some examples of aromatic hops would be Hallertau, which you'll probably remember is used in the Delirium Tremens, if I'm not mistaken. There's also Amarillo, and one of my personal favorites, Foggle, just because I just like the name. Okay, so now the other thing with hopping is that there is two different methods, or there is the base method, I should say, which is adding the hops at the boiling stage of the beer, and then there's dry hopping. So dry hopping, as you guys may have seen, there are some of our beers, such as the La Guillotine or the Saison DuPont dry hopped. What this is basically after they have brewed the beer, then they add a whole bunch of hops, you know, based on what sort of flavor profile they want to impart into the beer. And then they put it into a big bag and they chuck it in the beer and they let it soak. Okay. So what that does is it releases the more aromatic flavor of the hops without releasing too much of the bitterness. So this is where you can really extract that beautiful floral flavor from hops without taking the bitterness to an extreme level. Okay, so how are we gone so far? Everybody good? Everybody following along okay? I'm waiting for a response, by the way. By the way, guys, I'm going to send you my notes after the live stream is ended, so you can all read them. Okay. All right. So let's get into let's see how much you guys remember. Who can quickly tell me which type of, or what are the two types of beer? The two main categories of beer. What are they? Jenny, you should be able to leave a comment in the live chat. Very good, Rebel. Ale and lager. Same thing with Raj. Very good. Okay. All right. So now, what are the differences between ale and lager? Firstly, ale is a top fermented beer. Okay. Top fermented means that during the fermentation process, the grain and the yeast and the mixture, which is commonly known as the wort, is sitting at the top of the fermentation tank, right? And top fermented beers, aka ales, are fermented at higher temperatures, so 17 to 23 degrees Celsius. Okay, these were also the original beers. Okay, so ales have been brewed for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And while it is not certain specifically where they originated from, it is commonly thought that they were originally brewed in Mesopotamia. Okay, but it can definitely be argued that it was the Europeans that really refined the process and really made it what it is today. And certainly the three big players would have been the Belgians, the Germans, and Amsterdam. Okay. Sorry, not Amsterdam, Austria. So the second type of beer, lager, is what we call a bottom fermented beer. So lager is a newer style of beer, especially compared to ale. Lager really only came on the scene around the 1500s, and it is most commonly thought that it was created by the Austrians and the Germans. Okay, so lager is, as I said, is bottom fermented, meaning that the wort sits at the bottom of the tank during the fermentation process, and the fermentation temperatures is 5 to 10 degrees Celsius. Okay, so again, lager is more of a beer which was suited to those colder European climates. Okay, so I hope you're managing to follow along from here. Hope I haven't lost any of you. So next up, let's cover, what was on my schedule? Beer styles, right? So now there are lots of different types of lagers, and there are lots of different types of ales. But in terms of lagers, the only thing that I really would expect you guys to know at this point is that lagers are the most popular style of beer in the world. They were initially brewed in the 1500s. Who's Ace Show again? Is that a question for me, or are you asking a question for somebody else? Somebody just asked me. I have an example for lager. Either way, I'll answer that for you. An example for lager is typically any mass-produced beer that you see on the market these days. So Carlsberg, Tiger, Heineken, Corona, Budweiser, Miller. Okay, these are all lagers, right? So lagers, as I said, are the most um, popularly consumed type of beer in the world, and we are talking billions of liters per year. They are often fermented en masse. They are quite a bit easier to produce than ales are, as they are a bit more stable and easier to ferment consistently. Okay, so Germany is obviously the leader in terms of like bespoke, custom craft pilsners. Sorry, not pilsners, lagers. Um, but definitely, as I just mentioned, Campus is also a lager. This is true. Thank you, Manu. Campus is a craft lager that we serve at Delirium for those of you that work at ABC. Okay. So now, um, Campus is a beautiful lager. It's a very simple beverage, like most lagers are. They don't tend to be too complex. Usually, they will range in bitterness. The bitterness can be quite mild, right up to something really intense. A good example of that would be Corona, which was described by a famous beer reviewer named Michael Jackson. No relation to the singer, but there was a beer reviewer named Michael Jackson that once described Corona as mild corn water, which is I think is a very accurate description of it. I find it completely tasteless and boring. And then you've got the other end of the scale, which is something like Heineken, which is like really quite intensely bitter, and it leaves a really lingering bitter aftertaste on the palate. Okay, so now traditional lagers, as I mentioned before, were originally brewed in Germany and Austria, and they were higher in alcohol than the typical lagers that you see on the market these days. So you might be looking at something around 5 to 6, maybe 7%. And they would usually much less hoppy and more towards the malt character side of things. Okay, so examples of typical German lagers that you may hear about might be the Bock, the Eisbock, the Dunkel, the Held, and of course the Pilsner. So the Pilsner is quite an interesting one because it's actually named after the Czech city of Pilsen, even though it is a German style of beer. Very weird. I'm not really sure why, but that's what I uncovered during my research. So, and then of course, mass-produced lager, as I mentioned before, Tiger, Carlsberg, Heineken, all that sort of stuff. So then you've got ales. Now, ales come in an extremely wide variety of styles. But let's just cover the basics, which are your blonde ales, your stouts, white ales, and we'll do some lambics as well. So blonde ales are typically using a much lighter malt character and not overly hoppy. Although, again, this really depends on the brewer and what they're trying to bring out of the beer and what sort of flavor profile they have in mind. But a blonde ale usually is more of a middle range beer, like as in terms of like its flavor profile. It's very well balanced. It's malty, it's bitter, but it's nothing too extreme on either side of the scale. Okay. Again, they're called blonde ales mainly because of the color. So when you look at the beer itself, you're going to notice that it has a. Amy's here, Emma. So when you look at the color, you're going to notice that it has that really sort of golden blonde straw color. So on the other side of the scale, right, you've got your stouts, stouts and porters. As I mentioned earlier, a stout is basically an ale that is brewed with a really dark roasted malt, and that will impart a really thick sort of, okay, how to describe the taste of malt. Okay, when you drink Milo, now I'm sure all of you have drunk Milo before. Milo is a malted chocolate beverage, right? So when you drink Milo and you taste that, there's like a certain sort of flavor which is underneath the chocolate, and that is malt. Okay, so if you can imagine that flavor subtracted from the chocolate and intensified, that is the flavor which is really imparting most of the intensity into a stout. But the roasting of the grain will also add in chocolate and coffee flavors very typically. Now, as you guys know who work with me, darker ales are definitely my preferred style. And I've definitely given you guys more dark ales to taste than lighter ales. So you all should know by now what I mean when I say it has that sort of chocolate and coffee note in it. It's not because there is chocolate or coffee in it. It's mainly just because of the way that the grain has been roasted. Okay, so white ales. Now, white ales, as I mentioned before, are wheat based, and they are not malted. Okay, so these are ales that are using added enzymes to allow the yeast to consume the sugars and create the alcohol and the carbon dioxide from that, which is, again, as I mentioned before, what lends it to have that really sort of light and fruity, aromatic sort of flavor profile to it. So yeah, I think that was about as far as I wanted to get. I hope I haven't confused you guys. So now let's do some Q&A. Let's not spam the chat too fast, but if you guys have any questions, please go ahead, type them in the chat now, and I'll see if I can answer them for you. Has anybody got any questions or not? Okay, let me ask you guys some questions then. Okay, what is Peter? Huh? What does that mean? Are you talking about peated whiskey, Azri? The chat goes quiet. Okay, all right, let me ask you guys a question. We'll get back to Azri's question later. Okay, so I want one of you to, let's see who gets it first. Whoever can type the answer in first will get 5 points. Which type of yeast, or rather, sorry, which type of beer does the following yeast produce? Saccharomyces cerevisiae. Oh, Pater, as in the Pater 6. Okay, I'll get to that after this. So which beer does Saccharomyces cerevisiae produce? Well, okay, yeah, if that's the answer to my question, then technically, yes. Saccharomyces cerevisiae is the yeast used to produce ales, of which the Pater 6 and the Panapot are ales. So they would use Saccharomyces cerevisiae. Now, so in answer to your question, Asri, the Pater 6 is a strong dark ale, okay? Pardon me. Um, now, I don't know an awful lot about the Pater 6. I do know that it is an Abbey style, and that means that it is produced using traditional monk methods, hence the reason that it has the monk on the label of the bottle. It definitely is more of a fruity style dark ale, I guess I would call it that. It tends to lead with a lot of sort of like dark sweet fruit flavors. These are like raisins, cherries, plums. It's got a very noticeable sweetness to it. It's not overly bitter, and it's got a really nice thickness on the palate as well. It's certainly not as thick as the Panapot, but definitely there is a thickness there. Its ABV, if I'm not mistaken, should be about 6.5, 7, around there. Now, who was it that asked me about the Panapot? That was because I love the Panapot. Now, the Panapot is an absolutely amazing beer. Probably one of my all-time favorite beers that I've ever tried in my entire life. So the Panapot is what's referred to as a quadruple, or rather, it's a quadruple style. Now, just to give you guys a little bit of a basic understanding, double, triple, and quadruple. What does that mean? It essentially means that you're using, in the sake of a double the normal amount of malt that you would use in a regular ale to create that beer. The term double and triple was actually coined by the Westmalle Brewery. For those of you that work in Delirium and know the menu, you should recognize the name Westmalle. It's a Trappist brewery, meaning that the beers that they produce are produced by monks, exclusively by monks in a monastery, and they are not sold to the public for profit. They are sold to the public just to cover the costs of upkeeping the abbey itself, and the daily living expenses of the monks. So the Westmalle Trappist Abbey coined the term double and triple as a way of explaining their beer and explaining to the public that it had double the amount of malt or triple the amount of malt in it. As a general guideline, triples are like a golden colored ale, whereas doubles and quadruples are dark. This is not a set rule. You can have quadruples and triples. You can have quadruples that are light, and you can have triples that are dark. But typically, doubles are dark, triples are like golden, and quadruples are dark. So going back to the Panapot is a quadruple style, and because it has so much malt in it and so much sugar, because of the amount of malt, it's also got a very high ABV, which is around about 10%. But the most interesting thing about the Panapot is that it's got this really intense raisiny note to it, and it's also because of its viscosity and also its high ABV. It is a beer which can be aged for quite a long time. I mean, you could easily age a Panapot for around about 10 years. Okay, and it's much like a wine, it's going to sort of increase in complexity as it ages, which is also the reason that the Panapot is quite expensive here in Malaysia, because as you guys know, In Malaysia, we have very high taxes on alcohol, so high ABV, high price. The other interesting thing about the Panapot is that it is a very, very much lesser known beer, even in Belgium. It's from the northwestern side of Belgium, from a rather small village. And if I'm not mistaken, the beer was named after the fishing vessels in that village called Panapots. So it's described on the bottle as a fisherman's ale. So probably not that surprising that it's got quite a high ABV. So is anybody any other questions from anybody? Okay, that's a really good question, Atika. So I think that's Atika. Might not be. Anyway, that's a very good question. Fermentation for lager is different. Okay, again, that's a very good question. Okay, so base fermentation. Let's talk about the base fermentation first. Lagers will typically have a much shorter fermentation cycle than ales will. And also based on how long you ferment it for will very much affect the alcohol volume and the taste of the beer. If you ferment it for a really long time, the yeast is obviously going to consume more and more of the sugar, so you're going to get less sweetness and more and a higher alcohol volume. The lagers, as I mentioned before, are brewed at lower temperatures, like 5 to 10 degrees Celsius, for much shorter periods. So let's say probably only a couple of days. Whereas ales can be fermented for a month. It really depends on the brewery and what sort of beer they want to produce and what sort of flavor profile they want to get out of the beer. There's also another thing which you've just asked, which is bottle fermentation. So what is bottle fermentation? There are certain beers that the brewer, what they will do is they will ferment it once, and then once it has been bottled, then they might actually add some more yeast into the beer bottle and then seal it. Okay, and what that will do is it will create a second fermentation inside the bottle, which will give it a more specifically refined taste and also give it a more lively character in terms of its fizziness and its CO2 level, because when the yeast is consuming all of the leftover sugars inside the bottle, it's creating more CO2, but the CO2 doesn't have anywhere to go, so therefore it's really compounding inside the beer, inside the bottle. Okay, does that answer your question? Anyway, I hope that answers your question. So any other questions, guys? All right, well, if there's no other questions, I do think we might leave it there. So, okay, I would like to do this again, guys. I really hope that you have been able to take something of value out of this. I know that especially the first part was very chemistry heavy with a lot of big words and some confusing things. But rest assured, Google is your friend. All right. So if perhaps my accent was a bit hard for some of you to understand, or maybe the stream wasn't good and you didn't quite get any of that, just feel free to Google it, right? We've all got plenty of time on our hands at the moment. So yeah, if you want to know more about the yeast strains, or you want to know more about the different types of hops, all you need to do is just Google different types of hops. There are lots and lots and lots of different websites with loads of information about that there. Of course, you can always message me and ask me a question. More than happy to answer that for you. So I will schedule another training session in a couple of days, and we will go into some more depth about specific Belgian styles of beer. And I definitely want to get into some, do some explanation of lambic styles, because of the fact that they are such a unique and special type of beer. So that's definitely going to happen. In the meantime, I do hope you guys stay safe and try to keep your minds active. Yeah, at this time, we're considering that we're all stuck at home for a longer and longer period. You know, I know that it can be quite mind numbing. So try to get your brains ticking a bit. It'll make you feel pretty good. Trust me. That's after doing my research this, you know, over the past few days for this, I certainly felt pretty good about it. Okay. So yeah, that's about it. Stay safe, and until next time, have a good one.